program at Brown and of the Kerr Vital Energy Collaborative, a group of scientists and humanists and artists who are working together to better understand the theory and practice of vital energy and its role in the modern world. As the Director of Contemplative Studies, I just want to take a moment to ask people to, if you will, at some point in the next a day or two, turn to our website to look at the statement that we've made about anti-Asian racism that has really exploded in this country in the last year. We strongly deplore, unequivocally condemn the wave of anti-Asian racism that has been sweeping across our country, and that we ask all of you to continue to combat racism and otherism in all its forms, including gender bias and systemic racism that prevents anyone, especially peoples of color, from attaining the meaningful lives to which all human beings aspire and to which all human beings are entitled. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the moderator for this evening, my colleague, Dr. Larson DeFiore.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to what is now the fourth event in the Catherine Kerr Vital Energy and Health and Healing series. And this is also the first roundtable discussion in this series. We'll be gathering together the speakers who have previously joined us to present on a variety of topics. And we will be asking them questions based on those that participants had submitted through our online, through a Google Doc online form. And we'll be having a discussion around those different topics. So tonight, I'd like to welcome again our guests who continue to be very generous with their time to continue joining us and participating in these events. First, we have Professor Heiner Fruehauf, who is the founding professor of the College of Classical Chinese Medicine at the National University of Natural Medicine in Portland, Oregon. We have Professor Nancy Chen, who is a professor of anthropology at UC Santa Cruz. And we also have, I think, Professor David Palmer, is a professor of anthropology jointly appointed by the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities of Social Sciences and the Department of Sociology at the University of Hong Kong. These are our three speakers who have joined us previously. And we will be going through, the format of this discussion is I will be asking questions to them, and they will each have an opportunity to respond based on their own perspectives on each of these questions as we go through. So without further ado, and looking at, since we have many questions and not very much time, I'd like to begin. So the first question is, based on your research and experiences, what do you think Qi is, broadly or personally speaking? And for the many Qigong teachers and practitioners you have encountered, is it a metaphorical concept, a kind of explanatory system for other phenomena? Or is it something that has an ontological reality of its own that researchers should take into consideration? Are there common myths about it that should be avoided? How should Qi be defined? Or are there multiple ways that it should be defined in clinical practice? And so there's a lot of pieces to that. So feel free to answer as many of those as you would like. And let's begin with in chronological order of our talks. So let's begin with Professor Fruehauf.
All right, well, thank you so much for honoring me again with the invitation to participate here. Yeah, what is Qi in 5 minutes? When I gave my initial talk, I focused a lot about a cosmological perspective that from the I Ching, that like this division of reality into 5 parts, where the Qi was the second movement, so to speak, from the Tao to the three-dimensional reality. It's a momentum, a movement toward of the thoughts of the universe toward manifesting itself. So you could call it the movement or the momentum of the Tao toward manifestation in three-dimensional form. And that momentum translated into modern terms would be lots of different things, not just one. So, you know, electromagnetism in the broadest possible sense, sunspot activity, the solar wind, like one of the original terms where qi occurred was the Wuyun Liu Qi, the 5 planetary movements that then bring about the 6 weather patterns or the 6 qi. So that makes a 60-year cycle that the Chinese had for over 3,500 years or so. And that seems to, from a modern research perspective, coincide with certain kind of sunspot activities and solar wind activities. Light, color, right? Original qi was the yin yang, so light and dark, different kinds of light puts us also as humans in a different mood, temperature, certainly. Since all of the materia medicas of China, you have the herbs are not classified biochemically, but you have a qi and a wei, and the wei is the flavor, and the qi is, so to speak, the temperature, warm or hot or so of the herb. And so altogether, you could say that qi is sort of a summary concept for invisible. I don't want to say immaterial, because modern science has advanced to a state where everything is in a certain way, like Professor Palmer pointed out, that wave duality, wave particle duality, right? Everything that is matter is also has a field, and everything that has a field, if you look some kind of hone some kind of super sensitive spectrometer on it, you will also find some kind of particles in there. So invisible vibrations or forces that carry information. And so whether it's the gravity or gravitational pull of the planets, that of course has an effect, you know, everything on Earth affected by that, including the human body, cosmic rays, like University of Chicago has a decade-long research project about these particle showers that come down constantly from the universe. Nobody knows what that does or so, but that's all heavenly qi from an ancient perspective that has some kind of effect on us humans. Furthermore, also something, a term I heard recently in light of the pandemic, there is something that has been coined the virome, right? So that we turn on the news and seems like there is this singular virus out there, when really every liter of seawater has hundreds of billions of different viruses in it at any given time. 1 gram of soil has hundreds of billions of different viruses at any time. 1 gram of baby feces after a single week, after birth, before even the immune system has kicked in, has hundreds of millions of different viruses in just 1 gram of feces. And somehow all of that is interacting harmoniously with each other without needing to be controlled and shut down. You know, just way too complex for us to perceive. And I think the biggest thing about qi is that all of these different planes, they work together, right? Zhuangzi had the Yi Qi Lun, this everything is one qi, but what it really means is there are all of these different layers of unfathomably complex informational vibrations out there, but they all move as one. And so that is the one qi is that the many different manifestations of invisible forces, they move as one, as if intelligently bound together. And so that is when we then come to researching that, we need to be careful, and I'll reiterate that later. I think another question was like that we're not just focusing on one thing and say it's electromagnetism, that's the chi, or it's the this and that and the other. It's many layers. And of course, in the human being, biophotons, the electricity in our body that we can dramatically control and increase by even taking a simple breath, by doing visualizations, by using certain sounds, or immersing ourselves in feelings of gratitude, of love, of compassion. Our heart is already radiating as a frequency generator energy toward other people that even if they're not Qigong masters, they can feel that. And then, of course, we have the Xie Qi, right? We have the negative Qi that is blocking the ability of all of these layers of Qi of working together harmoniously. And that can be natural, like something like in southern Germany, where I grew up, there's something called der Föhn, the blow dryer, and comes down from the Alps, from Italy, and it disturbs the Schumann waves, which is a natural vibration in the universe that's at 7.8 hertz. That is the same as the hippocampus vibration of the human being. And then if you're immune compromised, your body aches, or you feel tired, etc. And so there is natural weather patterns that can block beneficial information that energizes us. But a lot of it is man-made, right? Air pollution, noise pollution, blue light pollution, as we look at the computer, EMF and RMF radiation. I can highly recommend Arthur Firstenberg's excellent book, The Invisible Rainbow, The History of Electricity and Life, which is tracking the effect of artificial qi in the form of electricity on our natural bio qi in the body. And last but not least, of course, environmental estrogens that give women breast cancer and men prostate cancer. Those are all sort of negative things out there. And of course, also opposite of the gratitude, compassion vibration, all right, we had the Wu Yun Liu Qi. There's also the Wu Xing Liu Qing, the 5 heavenly natures like gratitude, compassion. But on the negative side, if I'm broadcasting hatred from my heart toward another person, they can also feel that as a disturbance of their field. Myths to avoid, to conclude, is if something cannot be detected with a modern machine or by the current instrumentation of Western science, it cannot exist. We want to avoid that because that's always the technology constantly changes. You know, we talked a lot about the 90s and what was possible to measure then. This is already exploded, and we have much more sensitive type of equipment now. And then secondly, I would also say we are made of qi. Qi is all around us. It's not, you know, only powerful masters have the capacities to sense and generate qi. It's not it's not like that, but we are qi generators. And it's just everybody with relatively simple methods can immediately change the absorption rate or the interaction rate or the we have the ability with these exercises to maximize this harmonization of all of these different layers of microbiome and virome and bacteria and electricity and all of that working together in the body. That is sort of what I had. I hope I wasn't too long here.
I think that was really fascinating. I mean, speaks to how multidimensional this question is, how multidimensional qi is. It's really, you're right. Talk about qi in 5 minutes. What are we going to do? So I'll get out of the way and I'll turn to Professor Chen, please.
Sure, and I also want to join Dr. Fruhoff and Professor Fruhoff for thanking the Center for Contemplative Studies for inviting us back. To all of you here tonight, taking time out of your evening to join in this conversation, and then especially to Professor Roth for his opening remarks. Thank you so much for your note of solidarity, and also to Professor Di Fiore for your wonderful questions. It's actually hard to follow up after Professor Fruhoff's beautiful and really eloquent descriptions of Qi. I think very much he was able to describe how much of Qi is life itself. And so perhaps all I can add to that is really thinking about the ways in which the singular translation of Qi as vital energy is just not enough, right? That it's so important to really think about all the, not just the cosmological ways, but also just the different ways in which Qi can be experienced and to be felt, to be understood, comprehended in various ways. Particularly as an anthropologist, we like to think with categories. And so I'll suggest 3 words or 3 categorical elements to think about Qi. The first is about animation and the ways in which Qi animates so many different things, not just human bodies, but the environment, animals, but also that, you know, the unseen, what Professor Fruhoff has talked about, the invisible, that there's a way in which our bodies are connected to our environments are connected to other elements. And so there's so many forms, but especially the animation of that. It's not the static entity, it's something that is very dynamic and constantly transformative. Another category that, particularly in thinking about Qi, with regard to mind-body healing, is that of the multiplicity and plurality of contexts. And Professor Fruhoff has done an incredible job describing the ways in which it can be, whether we're talking about the virome or whether we're talking about simple forms of breathing or complex forms of breathing, that there are ways in which the context really matters. So in addition to animation and context, the last word I want to think about is connection, that there's a connectivity between the context in which Qi can be measured or not, in ways in which Qi might be felt or not, in which Qi might be observable or not. And so regardless of whether it can be measured or identified, I think what's really fascinating are all the ways in which the connectivity. So another thing I often tell my students is, don't just focus on the object of study, which in this case might be Qi, but also focus on the objects of analysis. Where does Qi lead us, right? Where does Qi guide us to in terms of understanding not just certain types of connections and contexts, but what is it actually animating and bringing forth? You know, what types of liveliness and lives are possible as a result of animating certain forms of Qi through certain forms of practice. So I think that the questions have really helped us to really not just identify Qi or define it, but help us to think through that Qi is really this incredible way to see the world and to understand that it is a multiplicity of experiences and forces that we should pay very close attention to. So I'll go ahead and end here and pass it back to Professor Di Fiore.
Well, thank you very much for, I think having those categories really helps us frame our thinking. And also turning now to kind of that more practical element you were bringing up, moving from the theory of what is Qi. The next topic that we have is kind kind of getting more into the modern day. So all of your talks have highlighted the many changes that occurred in the 20th century as classical Chinese medicine and traditional body technologies encountered Western science, philosophy, and medicine, creating the TCM, the traditional Chinese medicine, and Qigong we know today. What were the most significant changes that occurred, and did they affect the ways that Qi and the relationship of body and mind were understood? What in the history of the Qigong evolution should we not lose sight of in bringing Qigong into Western clinical practice? How should we account for the different cultural understandings of elements surrounding Qigong, like the concept of martial or Qigong virtue, Wu De, and its relationship to the practice? And let's begin turning to Professor Fruhoff.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the most significant changes that have occurred in China itself of looking at Qi and Chinese medicine and everything associated with it, Qigong included, is, of course, from my perspective, have to do with the influx of Western science into China. And I will, just because there was so much, last year was a special year, and in that Wuyun Liu Qi, that 60-year cycle that I mentioned, it was the year Gengzi, and that is like not just the year of disaster, but of political turmoil and revolution and potentially oppression by invaders, so to speak, and very dogmatic polarization, etc., and old systems fighting with new systems. And so we having the years 2020, 1960, 1900, 1840, so using this format to describe those changes. 1840, of course, was the Opium War, and is usually like my first field of study in things Chinese when I was at Fudan University for 2 years, was what is called the 现代文学, modern literature, and you had like a 近代文学before that. So the 1840 is sort of a mark of when something majorly changed, because there was the British moved their opium and then kind of had this revolution in burning off the opium by the General Lin Zexu, I think, seem to remember that. And then that brutal oppression thereof, and therefore the forcing of Western ways of thinking and imperialism, colonialism, etc. And that brought with it also changes in medical thinking. And one of those changes, maybe a little bit earlier, but around that time, just as an example, was the Chinese physician Wang Qingren, who is sort of like one of the 中西结合 thinkers, the East-West combination medicine, where you're trying to combine the two sciences. And so many medicine practitioners in the past was educated, and therefore was a district magistrate and had the key to the house where the dead people were. And so his hobby was anatomy. He was, even though that was forbidden, he cut open bodies and then wrote the book Yilin Gai Cuo, changing the mistakes in the medical texts that existed to date, basically changing anatomical ideas or descriptions of organ networks as they've occurred in Chinese medicine so far. Because even the Neijing already has descriptions of how big the bladder is and what dimensions and volume, etc. But those are primarily symbolic. Like the bladder in the Neijing is described as being 9 inches high and 9 inches wide and contains 9 cubic inches of fluid. So that's obviously not an exact description. It uses the number 9 because the bladder has something to do with governing the spine, right? Going close to heaven and bringing the humans close to that. And so he misunderstood that because he was already using Western material lenses to look at the functional record, the functional description of the organ networks. And that's why later people were saying, 一零改错,越改越错. That book, Changing the Mistakes in the Medical Force, the more he changed it, the wronger it got, because he was really, but his formulas were great. Like even this morning, I used his 血府逐一汤, the spell stasis from the mansion of blood decoction, the fabulous for preventing dissolving clots and preventing heart attacks, etc. But his theory was, that was then we have the Boxer Rebellion 60 years later, again the Gengzi, again like epidemics next to political upheaval, again the Boxers trying to throw off the yoke of the imperial invaders, so to speak, this time not just the British, but encircled all these embassies in Beijing, again got brutally repressed, and then again kind of hastening the demise of the entire imperial system, and starting the beginning of the Republic, having Sun Yat-sen now come in, who was a Western trained doctor, who one of his first things was to abolish Chinese medicine, because it was like superstitious kind of stuff, everything resembling old China. And then that of course didn't succeed because too deeply rooted in Chinese culture. And then Mao Zedong tried the same again, sort of at the end of the Great Leap Forward in 1960s, sort of foreshadowing that's when all the Chinese Medicine College were founded. So this looks like it is an advancement forward, but the first 2 years were Western medicine training, with the exception of 1963, after Wu Lao Shangshu, the 5 elders, wrote letters and said, this is going to be the demise of Chinese medicine if we use these structural materialist lenses to look at our qi-based medicine, our functional-based medicine. But then, so they reversed the curriculum for 1 year, and then again came the Cultural Revolution, no school for 10 years, and then they went back to what it is now. And now in 2020, we have again something that looks like great promotion of Chinese medicine. I got a call yesterday from one of the people there who run the Tongrentang, the oldest pharmaceutical factory there. And he said, great news that there is an edict that came down. The government is fully behind Chinese medicine, right? Because of COVID, after the first months, every hospital was using Chinese herbs, whether they believed in it or not. That was government mandated, and probably helped them to get the pandemic under control over there more clearly. But it just is, again, from an extremely biochemical kind of perspective, when you read this plethora of articles that's coming out of China right now about all of these antiviral type of herbs, it's moves Chinese medicine forward, but actually from this functional medicine perspective, the qi perspective, into a more monodimensional rather than multidimensional direction. There have been, of course, different kinds of counter movements. Our College of Classical Chinese Medicine being just one little blip there. But overall speaking, this entire influence of Western materialist scientist thinking has had the biggest influence on Chinese medicine teaching, Chinese medicine research, and also on the way how Qigong is being presented. What do we need to consider when bringing Qigong to the West? There is no need to use China, mainland China, as a model, because there's such unique political circumstance there that is not necessarily the best way, because you have these two polarities. Is on one side you have that under the auspices of this scientist movement that I think all three of us really talked about, that how, qi is a substance and it can be, so there was almost this movement in the 90s where the Communist Party was even encouraging people to do Qigong, and everybody, including the Communist Party members themselves, were doing it. Until then, there was this, and it was like a type of sport. You know, it was sort of like a type of cao that would benefit the health of everybody. But then there's also this undercurrent of this, you know, because you don't have religion at that time already, for one, and the human spirit needs this kind of engagement of the spirit. And so you have this tendency to go find yourself a master, and then almost have this like very, we heard both Professor Chen and Palmer describe that from their experience in the 90s. And I saw that myself also, you know, like people kowtowing and having people venerated in this godlike fashion. So there's like these two extremes that are not very suitable for bringing it into everyday life around the globe, when it's really not such a rocket science kind of a thing that only few people can understand. And so, yeah, so those are my thoughts about that. Thank you.
Thank you also for giving us that wonderful narrative arc of the development of, I think, and it's important to have that kind of a timeline, I think, to keep it in mind how this has been an extended process. Let's turn now to Professor Chen and your answers.
Yes, and I also want to join Dr. Fiore in thanking you for beginning, Professor Fruhoff, for the beginning with the Guns, right, the 60-year arc as a way to kind of think through not just the 20th century, but the fact that, you know, the 20th century is very much the imagination of what took place in the 18th and 19th centuries as well, that there's so many things happening, beginning with the Boxer Rebellion at the very start of the 20th century. So my comments are going to be more focused on contemporary China, looking at from the beginning that in some ways that Qigong was contiguous with contemporary China. So just over the past 60 years, and in particular at mid-20th century, the creation of Qigong as a neologism, that's a very key moment where a lot of Chinese leaders and medical researchers were trying to, in a sense, claim Qigong as something uniquely Chinese. And the other fascinating side story to that is putting it under the house of Chinese medicine. So just really thinking about the ways in which Qigong literally, you know, with Liu Guizhen in the late 40s and early 50s, opening a clinic in Beidaihe, and also treating many Chinese state leaders, but also, you know, there was that initial flourishing of Qigong during that mid-20th century period. I actually had another key moment with actually resonates with Professor Fruhoff's point about scientization, and in particular, the ways in which Western science comes to influence the study of Qigong, in particular through experiments to either quantify Qi or determine, excuse me, to determine whether there might be material forces or effects that could be measured. And then really the other aspect of another key moment was really in the late 20th century. And this is where I, at the moment when I entered and did my field research in the psychiatric wards, and really looking at the influence of cross-cultural psychiatry and the really interesting travel of how Qigong deviation was, in a sense, not so much created, but described as a uniquely, you know, whether it's practice specific or culture specific, but in the end gets created and codified in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual edition 4 as a culture-bound syndrome. So I would say that those are the three moments that are of particular interest for me as a researcher with regard to the story of Qigong and its, you know, evolution during the mid to late 20th century. What not to lose sight of. I think there are several elements, and this resonates quite a bit with Professor Fruhoff's points about multiplicity, that whether it's from classical martial texts or medical texts or martial arts, whether it's about the phenomenology of qi, the experiences, as well as the social phenomenon of charismatic masters, these are all part of that history that we should not lose sight of. But in particular, there's a way in which Qigong becomes, with scientization and with it being under the umbrella of medical qi, that we need to also still not lose sight of the fact that it's a very charismatic experience. There are very charismatic healers, and the spiritual connections, the mind-body healing is still very, very profound. And so we need to not lose sight of that, that even despite trying to make sure that it's governed and contained, that those experiences are still very, very profound. So I'll turn it back to Larson.
Thank you. So let's turn to the next question. We're focusing a little bit more here. And so you both brought up kind of some of the issues with the developments in the 20th century in China. And so now perhaps we can turn to the, maybe some of the more specific ways we can troubleshoot what happened and look at what were the benefits and what were perhaps the not so good parts. So you've, in your different talks, you've touched on the ways that Chinese scientists, doctors, and elites sought to examine the principles of Chinese medicine and qi-based practices through a modern scientific lens. What are the most important lessons present-day researchers can draw from that history? What did they do right? What did they not? What worked in China at that time and what didn't? And might some of the strategies that were unsuccessful at that time due to the political, social, or technical limitations at the time be more successful now in a global international research environment? So let's turn first to Professor Fruhoff.
Thank you. There are two things that come to mind here for me. I think it was, of course, a great thing, even though politically motivated and primarily, but whether it is now or whether it was in the late 50s when the first colleges and universities of Chinese medicine were established in Chengdu and then Beijing and Nanjing and Guangzhou, is this during the 20th century when everybody was in the scientific frenzy of discovery and thinking we can explain everything with the parameters of Western science, to start appreciating not just the philosophical and cosmological value of the ancient theories surrounding Chinese medicine and qi, but also, to celebrate that and bring that into actual usage in the form of qigong, in the form of medicine. In the way of how to make that palatable, however, then there were, too much emphasis, whether it was in examining qigong masters and whether they're real or not, as well as in measuring is the phenomena of the qi in the meridians real or not? Is it a form of light? Is it a form of electricity? Is it a magnetism, etc.? Using equipment that is made out of matter, it's very difficult to kind of key into something that is immaterial then. And then just because we are not finding anything, or at least at the beginning, not always. I mean, sometimes they did find things to conclude, that there is a different kind of, this is fake, or need to come up with some kind of theory that's not entirely proven at the time, but just for political reasons, then make sense of it on paper and publish a paper on how this qi is a material thing. To come back to that first question, what is qi? I think when we are researching qi without having the political pressure of proving that it's a material thing, the following things, I think, in the future research, and some of it is already being done, need to be looked at. Number one is this complexity and multidimensionality of the qi component that we've spoken, that also Professor Chen here has mentioned several times. There is something interesting, right? The ultimate term for the order of the universe is Tao. It's this kind of laws, before there even is qi, there is the laws of how that qi will move once it's set in motion. So Tao is order, but it's also the term, the opposite to it, luan, which means chaos. They are also an explanation of each other. So in a certain way, this the term luan is looking at right, there's a chapter 41, I think, in the Tao Te Ching that says real purity looks dirty and real greatness looks small, etc. And so there was a recognition that the universe is infinitely complex, way too complex to enumerate it all on a piece of paper. And it looks chaotic, but it's infinitely ordered. And so when we research, for instance, a single plant, we think there's only one active ingredient and it does that. When we look at fertilizer, we think it's only calcium and magnesium and potassium that is necessary in the soil to produce plump plants, not looking at the other 165 or so trace minerals that are in the human blood and existent on our Earth and are complete in the Dead Sea, for instance. So we all have this tendency to just focus on one thing rather than looking at everything. And we have this tendency to think, what is there more that must be the most active? And sometimes it's the smallest thing. That is, for instance, lithium is extremely important trace element. And the more is in the water, the lower the suicide rate, and the less is in the water, the higher the suicide rate in municipalities in the United States. But it's in tiny, tiny little amounts. It's otherwise would be toxic, but a little bit goes a long way in affecting how people feel. So there are lots of other things like yttrium and things we've never heard about, and even arsenic and mercury that we think are toxic are actually physiologically are a type of qi, a type of information that we need as humans. So looking at everything, whether it's in the world of biochemistry or biophysics, as complex and multidimensional, embracing the luan part of it and seeking the ordering principle that pulls it all together. So Chinese medicine is always systems theory, and it's this qi that keeps all of these different layers of reality that resonate with each other, bound together. Secondly, these layers don't just exist independent next to each other equally, but there is a hierarchical principle. Like Jing Qi Shen, it's the Shen Qi, that governs the bioelectrical qi, and that governs the Jing Qi. So in the body, mind, spirit, a way of looking at things, it's always that spirit governs energy movement, and energy forms and influences the formation, and literally informs matter, in the sense that Rupert Sheldrake has these morphogenic field theory. So complexity, hierarchy, and the importance of subjectivity versus objectivity is very important. Like in Chinese medicine, when I ask a patient, how do you feel when they have a 106 fever? if they say I'm feeling ice cold and I'm shaking, the bed is shaking, the prescription would be cinnamon and ma huang, ephedra, which is the hottest medicines that are available, because you go more rather than packing them in ice, which invariably is what would happen in a Western emergency room. So also rather than going with some instrument that tells you whether something's happening or not, it's a subjective experience of the practitioner, or how you feel. It's like, right, it's you could use some kind of a electromagnetic tester, so just go like, this is the right point, and then put it in there. The patient feels nothing. You have objective feedback that this is where the point is, but the patient tells you, I'm not feeling anything. I'm not feeling the qi. So the subjectivity is, in a certain way, the more quote unquote scientific principle in this functional medicine science. And then the importance of belief. If you believe in something, right, the one way how we interpret qi is 信息 means information, but literally it means believing and absorbing. So if I'm not believing in it, I'm not relaxing, and as a result of it, things cannot come into my system, right? You go, for instance, to some mystical ceremony, and you all open and surrendered. Amazing things can happen, right? We all know that. Whereas if you go in there and think, oh, this is a bunch of nonsense, and you separate yourself from the very beginning, I guarantee that nothing is going to happen. So, and so rather than saying that belief is then something in Chinese ancient culture, of course, the belief is the foundation of it all, because it's the earth virtue, right? Without trust and belief, without xin, none of the other four elements and four virtues can come into existence. So rather than going like, oh, you are believing, you need to believe in it for this to work, and then excluding that from scientific observation, it's from a Chinese perspective, or from the Qi perspective, that is what makes it scientific, is that you need to be including the belief. And then the importance of naturalness is that if we go in a direction where we're injecting little chips into people that then diagnose and think that this chips into the brain, so we can immediately go on the internet and think that that is going to make us healthier as human beings in the future. From this Qi perspective, with Dao Fa Ziran, the most important sentence in the Tao Te Ching is that's always my principle when people come and tell me all about these Western medicine procedures they are planning to do. I say, I wasn't trained in that. I'm not a good counsel about that. I don't understand much, but in the end, my principle is always like just like my Sufi teacher said, when asked, how do you distinguish whether a thought in your head is the voice of God or not? He always said, if it's in the love, it's the right voice, whereas if it brings separation, it's the wrong one. So I always tell my patients, if it's natural, it's most likely the right kind of qi to expose yourself to, whereas if it's unnatural, then it will, at the very least, while temporarily helpful, it will always bring side effects with it. So those are some simple thoughts I have here.
Thank you so much, and also for bringing up the complex issues of the subjective experience and the relationship of how much somebody believes in the practice or trusts in the practice, and that effect on the efficacy of it. I'd like at this point to welcome Professor David Palmer, who's joining us from Hong Kong. And I have to apologize. I think in all of this planning, I neglected to mention the very odd tradition we have in the USA of daylight savings time and moving our clocks ahead an hour. And so I'm sorry, I think that kind of interrupted things here. But please, we're very happy to have you here, and welcome. And if you would like to contribute at this point, to jump in at this point about, we're asking about the studies that happened in China in the 20th century, what worked at that time and what didn't, and what strategies that were unsuccessful then due to various limitations might be successful now. And I'd be happy to turn the floor over to you. And welcome again.
Okay, yes, so hi everybody, and I'm really sorry, the daylight savings. In fact, I heard last week about daylight savings, but then I forgot also to readjust my my agenda. So anyway, so I'm sure you guys all had really great discussion so far. And so maybe before I directly answer your question though, I just wanted to kind of follow up or kind of debate a little with Professor Fruhoff on what he was saying about the importance of belief. Because maybe I think maybe what Professor Fruhoff is saying is true, but I think we should be careful not to, we have to think of how, what do we mean by belief here if we're talking about xin, right? I don't think this is about propositional belief that you have to, I believe only if you have an a priori belief in Qigong will it work. And in fact, I'll just share my own experience in the field. I mean, when I went in, I didn't believe in Qigong. That said, I wasn't there, I was going in as an anthropologist with an open mind and just to see what's going to happen. But I didn't come in there with, believing in Qigong. And well, I felt things, right? And actually one of my very first experiences, I went into this, it was actually a converted it was a temple, what was no longer a temple, but an old building in Chengdu, which long ago had been a temple and was converted into one of the Fudao Zhan of the Zhonggong, so one of the training centers of the Zhonghua Yangsheng Yizhigong, which was one of the biggest Qigong organizations in China at the time. And I went in and they had all these holograms of Master Zhang Hongbao, and it was all kind of, over the top in terms of, this kind of science fiction kind of thing that, ooh, here's Zhang Hongbao in a hologram, he looks 3D and it looks really, so that kind of made me it gave me some reactions, which was kind of, I didn't really like that. So I was not in a state of belief there. And then they said, okay, sit down here. And so I sat down on this bench and they said, close your eyes. And then they started sending qi to me. And I distinctly remember, I was wondering, okay, what's going on? And anyway, I with an open mind, and yet, my bag was right beside me, and I was a little worried they might take it, or, I even didn't really have much trust. So there I was, quite worried and sitting there. And then I realized that I couldn't move. I just felt, right, like a stone, an immobile stone, and I could not get myself out of this state. And that actually made me even more worried. So I think one of the aspects of xin is actually not belief, but it's trust. And if I had trusted them, maybe they would have gone even further. I would have let myself go. But actually I didn't trust them, and so I was resisting. And finally I broke myself out of this spell. But my experience shows, at least for me, that I did not have belief nor disbelief, and I didn't have much trust. And yet, in spite of that, I actually I felt something going on, and I felt it enough that I was actually worried. So I just wanted to say that, because the kind of, then if we start talking about the importance of belief, then we kind of get into that idea that, oh, well, it's all because they believe in it. And then, so there's nothing there, it's just belief. But actually I think that's a conceptual dead end, because if beliefs are so strong, then you should understand them, and different types of belief have different types of effects. And so therefore then the belief is actually an inoperable concept, because you still have to understand, well, why is this qi, so-called qi belief, more powerful than X other type of belief? Or why does this qi belief create this kind of effect that, why, X, Y, Z other belief doesn't create? So, so I think what Professor Fruhoff, I think his comment does kind of pose the question of what is the component, what is the component of xin, of trust, and even of belief in the overall effect and the overall configuration. So I think actually that's really important, but at the same time, I think we should avoid getting into this placebo effect and the power of belief and this kind of, throw the whole Qigong issue into that kind of very superficial type of debate. So then so the question then that you had just posed, I would actually, it's really directly tied to my answer to the first question, at least the first question that I was sent in a list. I don't know if you guys talked about it in that order, but really relates to the question of what is qi. And my understanding of how I would answer your question is, and then how do we deal with these kinds of concepts? And so my answer is qi is actually, it's a word, and it's nothing but a word. So the question is, what do you do with this word, with this Chinese character? And when we're engaging in naturalistic science, of course, I mean, we're always also inventing concepts and inventing intellectual constructs to describe and theorize phenomena. So to describe and theorize externally, measurable or externally observable phenomena. And we use various types of words, and we even invent words and especially in the natural sciences, but even there's a tendency in the social science that the word should fit as closely as possible and as precisely as possible the phenomenon itself. So is there a phenomenon that can be described by the word qi? Well, I leave it up to the natural scientists to ask that question. I don't think so. I don't think there is any single phenomenon that is described by the word qi. But I don't think that's the way qi is used. I don't think that's what qi is about. So I don't think qi is a descriptive concept. I think it's a mediating concept. And so what that means is that word is used to connect different types of different types of subjective experiences, different types of feelings and sensations. And so it is used to connect them mentally, and also to connect them to other sensations from the environment, and also to connect to various concepts and to various notions, cosmological ideas, and so on. So I think qi is a mediating concept for connecting all of these different things together. Now, when you use this concept and you work with this concept, and you work with it mentally, and you really use it in terms of mediating concept for different things happening in your body and in your relationship with what's outside the body, and with cosmological ideas, it does create phenomena. It produces phenomena. It's certainly the goal when we're practicing Qigong is to produce some change, some transformation. And so it does produce some phenomena, but it produces all kinds of different phenomena. And so within the naturalist ontology, and when I gave my talk, I talked about the notion of polyontology. And so we're looking at things within different ontological frameworks. And so I think if we're in a naturalist ontological framework, we're not going to see anything that's called qi, but we can see, or we can observe and describe different types of phenomena. And those phenomena are, there is a theoretical language and the experimental apparatus to detect and observe certain types of phenomena within the naturalistic ontology. And there are other types of perhaps mental phenomena that simply cannot, because they are subjective and they will never be accessible. within the naturalist ontology. So I guess then my answer to question 3 is to actually respect the differences between these ontologies and not try to mix them up, because that's when you get all kinds of, you get confused. I think natural scientists working within a naturalist ontology should certainly use use the tools that are available to them within that ontological framework, and also respect the fact that those tools have their limitations as well. And there will always be massive aspects of reality that they will never, ever be able to access. But similarly, the Qigong, you know, those who are working within the Qigong or Chinese cosmological ontology can also reciprocate by admitting that this ontology also has its, it does, right, using these mediating concepts, it allows us to mediate our body, the environment, the cosmos in very powerful ways, but it also has its limitations. And so there are certain things that, certain types of experiences or certain types of languages which will never be accessible within that ontology. And so then the question is never how do you prove qi, or do the 12 meridians exist, or this or that, you know? Let those people who are working with the 12 meridians, with yin and yang and the 5 elements, let them do that, and let them do it with expertise, and let them do it in depth, and then see what are the results. Don't try to prove or disprove the existence of these things. Rather see what are the, how can these mediating concepts be well used? How can they be properly used? And then see what are the what kinds of effects are observable within the naturalist ontology. So I think that one of the issues that happened in China was there was this extreme desire to provide material proof for a lot of these different things. So a desire to collapse the two ontologies together, and then that's where you end up going all over the place. And because qi is perhaps within the Chinese cosmology, it's one of the concepts that appears to be somewhat more material. It kind of can be conceptualized as a substance. It's not really purely spiritual. So then there's the desire to isolate qi from other aspects of Chinese cosmology, to extract it and to turn it into something that can be operationalized within a naturalist ontology. And so then you have this distortion of Chinese cosmology where qi becomes it's the thing that you're always going after. And you're kind of forgetting about all the other concepts that are part of this cosmology. And Professor Fruhoff was talking about some of them. And so this single-handed pursuit of one thing, qi, at the expense of so many other things, actually is a distortion caused by this desire to incorporate an element of Chinese cosmology into the naturalist ontology, and it doesn't work. And finally, the other thing is to, I think, is a little bit humility in the sense that, it's great. These, these practices are great. Qigong and Taiji Chuan and Chinese medicine are great. But also neither this nor any other type of medical system, none of them is gonna, solve all the problems of the world. And so none of them is the be all and end all that's gonna, and so there was too much enthusiasm, I think, at the time that, this was it. And that led to I think, trying to run too fast and go too far. And actually, there's just a lot of work that needs to be done to really digest, all the implications of these practices and of these concepts.
Thank you so much, Professor Palmer, for that. I think really throwing some different questions in here, really kind of moving the conversation in different directions. It's great to have a lot of dynamic to this conversation. So thank you for that. So I don't want to take up too much time, so let's turn to Professor Chen.
Sure. And I also want to say that my response resonates quite a bit with Professor Palmer and Professor Fruehauf's responses. I especially appreciate the discussion about belief and about faith, because a common question in the parks as well as in the hospital was always, 你信不信? You know, do you believe or not, or are you a believer? So I'm not going to focus on that as much as another point that Professor Fruehauf brought up. And I really appreciated this notion of chaos and of order. And one of the things or lessons to carry forward in the 21st century is looking at the way in which certain binary systems in the regulation of Qigong during the 20th century came to really transform that initial, social phenomenon where there were so many people that believed in it and believed in the miraculous healing that was possible. What happened was that in observing bureaucrats and observing Qigong researchers, another binary came to emerge in the 1990s, and that was about, is it real or is it false, right? So along with the chaos and order, there was the real and false binary. And the way in which medicalization and scientization came to Professor Palmer raised this issue about how the materiality of Qi was something that a lot of scientists were focusing on because they believed that could be the answer. If we can measure it, then it must be real. So there was that concern about how do you govern and create order when there was this concern that there were too many charismatic masters, too many people practicing this phenomenon called Qigong deviation becoming more and more present. But I think a lesson that we can also carry forward with us in thinking about where to go today is really just thinking about the social phenomenon. And I think part of the reason why there was such a widespread appeal was not just the peer-to-peer, that was the moment in which, before social media, that was social media, that the world of Qigong was precisely people talking to each other and sharing their, experiences, their subjective experiences, particularly about healing. And I think it's really important to pay attention to those stories and be reminded and remember that it wasn't just a system of healing or a system of energy. It was really about accessibility. And so I think that as an anthropologist, I'm very, very interested in the ways in which these social realms were immediately accessible. So it was the practice, the social worlds that were generated in these very public spaces that I think is incredible. And so to carry forward in terms of research, to pay attention to the ways in which these practitioner worlds were really another realm to that also transformed Qigong and Qi itself. So I don't want to spend too much time because I know we have 3 more questions that we're going to go to, but I'll turn the mic back to Professor Di Fiore.
Well, thank you. Yes, we do have 3 more questions, but we have about 15 minutes left. So we might turn to, because also a lot of your answers have already been touching on some of the other questions we had, like a lot of it about I think one of the things that we're most interested in, or many people in this series are very interested in, is the potential applications, right, of Qigong looking forward. And in particular, the way that we can do clinical trials and we can look for ways of applying it moving forward. So I'm actually, because some of your responses have already combined a couple of these questions, I'm going to kind of merge questions 4 and 6 a little bit and sort of say when we're we're choosing, when we're making clinical trials and from a Western medical context, we use certain criteria, like for example, a particular system, that there's patients exhibit a particular symptom or they share a similar diagnosis. But this is different from the way that classical Chinese medicine or that a Qigong practice would diagnose or treat those treatments. So what kind of factors should we be looking at when we're doing this? Can we define a best practice for determining this? And then also related to this, how do we account for different kinds of potential negative side effects that could occur? So you've all talked about things like the Qigong deviation, the 左火入魔, the phenomenon, and other sorts of problems. How can we make sure that when we are testing in clinical trials and we are implementing it in hospitals or other situations, that we can avoid some of those problems? So I'm going to turn first to Professor Fruhoff.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to start by thanking Professor Palmer for the very important remark to make sure that my remarks about belief are not misunderstood, because I have the same experience, of course, every day in the clinic, that I get patients who don't believe in Qi, they don't believe in Chinese medicine, but they come there because the regular medical system cannot help them. And so they're skeptical, but then it still works, even though they might not be trusting to the degree where I would like to have them. The one thing that comes to mind here is that the original designation of the earth organ was actually the heart, before the heart became the fire organ. And so that virtue of trusting goes with that, and the heart was defined as being the portal to everything that is subtle. That's why all of these sensitive areas in the body, the armpit and the fingertips and the tongues and the eyes, etc., belong to the heart. And the one of the definitions, I think, in the Shuming dictionary is 心鲜也. The heart is about everything, or is like silken strings that connect you to the invisible part of the world. And the heart is described as an orifice. So the wider it is open, that portal, the more we perceive this pulsing reality that is around us. And maybe that's what practice, the cultivation of Qigong practices, or meditation, or Yangsheng, however we want to call it, is about, is this opening of that portal, so we perceiving of something that is always there and that is working on us at every second, whether we believe it or not, otherwise we would be dead. And so I had similar experiences also. I have people work on me in China who I distinctly didn't like, certainly didn't trust on a personal level, but within 30 seconds, I was like swaying and nauseous and thought I had to throw up, and undeniably had a very profound effect right away. It's just, I think the practice of trust is, it'll enhance that effect then more, as you pointed out. Yeah. In traditional diagnostic, you always in Chinese medicine, you treat the Qi, and you can't do that without diagnosing the Qi. And you have these 4 different categories that are called 望闻问切, is looking diagnosis, listening and smelling as it's translated, but that's more sort of an intuitive listening, right? The character is a door with an ear underneath it, and then asking questions and palpating the body, especially palpating the pulse, and then perceiving how the Qi moves in the human body. And particularly nowadays, we stay with more of the touching of the material body and asking questions, including Western diagnosis, again, about material things that afflict the body, whereas the highest levels was the looking and the intuitive listening. That is sort of a skill set that was associated with the Shangong, the upper level physician in ancient times. That's why I also find it interesting that I had the good luck to know and study with a person called Wang Qingyu, who was at some point in the 80s, was the designated person that the Chinese government used to find out whether certain claims of Qigong masters or extraordinary 特异功能 was real or not, because they felt like that their machines, they had clear limitations, and you needed somebody who was sensitive enough to kind of cast judgment on that. So I think once again, the inclusion of some of this human-based rather than machine-based detection of qi and being at a certain level of cultivation may be helpful. And then, of course, there are very, in terms of best practice, so that there isn't a side effect. From my limited perspective and experience as a Qigong practitioner and having practiced different kinds and posed a similar question to all of my teachers, there is sort of I could distill the following consensus. Number one, there needs to be a certain respect for the science of the past. So along the lines of what Professor Palmer said, you just let these people work within the parameters of their knowledge system rather than needing to take another system and then adopt everything that works, and stuff that you can't see, then throw that out. In the choosing of a Qigong form, I think there's nothing more important than what in Chinese call yuanfen, which is this kind of just connection to a particular teacher, because it's through that teacher maybe that you gain the trust and the patience to want to practice through these difficult times when you don't want to stand in the horse stance anymore. And so wherever you are, just finding somebody you resonate with, and ideally that person is teaching a traditional system. There was like the minute in the 90s you could start making money where it wasn't just permissible, but where it was a very economic way to the profession. All of a sudden, lots of people said, I'm the 87th disciple or lineage holder of this particular form. And it turns out a lot of them, they kind of self-created that. That doesn't mean that's not a good type of Qigong, but according to at least some of my teachers, they think that ancient Qigong practices, they've undergone thousands of years of experimentation, and they're always based on yin and yang. So if you have a movement like this, it's always followed by a movement like that. So you're not raising your blood pressure by constantly going like this, or vice versa. There's always this balance. And ideally, there is a certain completeness to the system. Like in some of the systems I learned, there is a shaking and a walking and a moving practices, and like 5 or 6 of them. And there's a sitting practice, and there are rules about when to practice what or so, rather than just have one kind of mantra practice or so. And that is all of that. So, but the most important thing is, I think, no matter who teaches you and no matter what form it is, if you feel like you have some benefit, just do it yourself. There is nothing better than practicing. And right, the Chinese word 学习, to learn, means to imitate and then do it again and do it again, do it again, because it will invariably inform you about how the qi is moving with each movement, with each breath. And then as you see a patient and prescribe that to somebody else, you can sort of feel, or just by the way they're moving, where the qi is blocked, or and then pick off the many movements that you learned, the one that you think is most beneficial for that. I think these kind of handbooks that say for breast cancer, do this movement, or they are helpful to some extent, but we have the same problem in institutionalized, hyper-standardized TCM, where for this Western diagnosis, you use this point combination in acupuncture and you use this herb combination that works to a certain degree, but it's not as good as individualized diagnosis, and that you can only do once you are intimately familiar with this formula or these points or these movements in these breath patterns that you've learned. And then I think, the concept of in the 21st century is, I think, is all about the finding the teacher within. You need somebody who gets you into the gauge, Heyrman, right? But that then afterwards, it's just about practicing yourself and opening that portal so you can detect and work with the chi yourself. Those were my thoughts about that question.
Those were fantastic thoughts. Thank you. So let's turn to Professor Palmer. What do you think about these? I think you're still muted.
I'm not really qualified, as I'm neither a TCM doctor nor a Western doctor, nor a psychiatrist. So the only thing that I would say, though, is I think that it's important, just as we have in Western medicine, there's a whole institutional structure and a community of practitioners who are thereby able to have a kind of critical discourse of what's going on, of what a critical collective discourse about what is appropriate or not within the framework of Western medicine. Now, part of the problem with these kind of Qigong is that it's totally uninstitutionalized. And so there is lacking this kind of a community. And that's what I mean about a community, is not a community of, the master and his disciples, but actually, a community of qualified practitioners who are, just like, well, in their own way, that creates a certain process of collective critical discourse on what's going on, and then collective norms of what's appropriate can arise. There can be a collective enhancing of quality and qualification. And so that is what can kind of help to avoid, certain groups or certain individuals ignoring certain safeguards in terms of trying to go too far, not paying attention to some people's psychological dispositions, which may actually interact in unhealthy ways with Qigong experiences. So I think looking forward, I think it's important that a community and within the TCM community and beyond, in the whole world of Qi practitioners, there needs to be, associations. And I think this is happening, but it just needs to move forward in a grounded way, so that there's a critical discourse within the community that allows certain norms to arise, and then certain practices well understood or consensually agreed upon safeguards and limits as to what is appropriate and not appropriate.
Thank you so much for highlighting this. I think this important notion of community and the standards by which we discuss these topics, I think is so important to keep in mind as we move forward. And last, I'd like to turn to Professor Chen for your thoughts on this question.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'll try to be brief because I know we've reached that time. But I just want to say that efficacy continues to be an issue, whether we're talking about biomedicine or if we're talking about Chinese medicine. There's always questions about does it work or not. And efficacy from the biomedical standpoint has primarily now evolved to address randomized controlled trials as the gold standard, so-called gold standard, where there are double-blind studies with placebo or not. And there's been some really fascinating survey articles talking about, there's one by Janke et al., a 2010 survey article that compared all the different health benefits of publications in English between 1993 and 2007, which includes studies from like 13 different countries that showed the 163 different physiological and psychological outcomes of practicing Qigong. And then more recently, in this past year, with the pandemic, 2020 publications that also include randomized control studies that look at the ways in which Qigong might be effective or not for addressing respiratory infections, pulmonary diseases, and other complications as a result of COVID. So that's one perspective, thinking about clinical trials. But I'm very, I think, compelled by Professor Fruehauf's point that there are other aspects of efficacy that we need to think about as well, in particular, touch and feeling, and the ways in which sensations, Professor Palmer is pointing out the ways in which we can also think about how certain guidelines emerged from within. And so in moving forward, I think there are lots of different possibilities for, of course, there are all these new technologies now to measure different elements, but it will be really important to continue thinking carefully about what constitutes efficacy. And perhaps the second part of the question, which is number 6, about how to how to raise awareness or mitigate concerns of adverse outcomes. I think historically it's always been teachers, masters, clinicians who have been able to guide other practitioners, their students, or patients to say, hey, you might experience this sensation or you might not. And this is part of that journey. But patient narratives and participant stories are another really interesting component to pay attention to. And so in thinking about side effects, anything may have side effects, whether it's a drug or whether it's a Qigong practice. So I think it's important to think about how, whether these experiences are part of the journey towards healing, or if it's kind of moving away from healing. Is it shia? Is it leaving that path, or is it part of the path? That's a real question. So I'll end here and turn it back to Professor Di Fiore.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful note to end on, about looking for the correct path. Hopefully, this series of events is helping to guide us in that direction. At least that's what we're trying to do. So I'd like to thank again our 3 speakers for today: Professor Heiner Fruehauf, Professor David Palmer, and Professor Nancy Chen, who've come back again and again. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us and sharing your knowledge. And it's been a wonderful experience to have you all here. And I'd also like to make a little advertisement. We're going to be sort of transitioning now towards starting to have conversations with practitioners about Qigong practice. And we will be leading off with, on April 22nd, Master Ken Cohen, who's here today, has graciously agreed to join us for a conversation about Qigong. So we'll be looking forward to that, and looking forward to seeing all of you the next time. So take care and stay well, stay safe.
Also, people, if you have questions that you did not get a chance to raise tonight, or comments or reflections that you would like to submit to our group, we have an ongoing process where we will be taking up these questions and discussing them as a group. And we would very much want to encourage you to submit them. We will bring them into future discussions. This is an ongoing program that we have, and we hope to continue it throughout the next year and continue these discussions, which have been really mutually beneficial and very much enlightening, to explore these pathways of understanding the nature of Qi and the Tao and the Li, or pattern or structure or natural laws, and whether or not we have incommensurable or complementary ontologies. Very interesting question. Thank you all so much for coming. Be well, stay safe.
Thank you so much. Fascinating discussion.